Well, I'm Chris Butler. I'm a senior product strategist at Philosophy New York City, which is a small product and design consultancy. And so we focus a lot on very early stage groups. So trying to take a founder and their idea to fruition to something that they can either prove or disprove or validate or invalidate that it's something worthwhile. Or we work with very large companies that are trying to innovate or trying to breathe new life into the business that they have. I think how I got here is actually a pretty long and windy road. I originally ended up, originally I started as a designer as an apprentice to my dad. And so he was a graphic designer, art director. And his vision for my future was to become something like an industrial designer for automotive, go to Art Center, College of Design. And basically, this was around the time that his industry was really digitizing. And so he moved from doing a lot of like linotype, actual typeset stuff that he would pick up and then cut up and put on tissue paper to do layouts to things like Quark Express and Adobe Illustrator. And so because I did a lot around computers, I ended up teaching like a computer programming course in my high school. Like I was just really into computers at the time, a lot around programming and some maybe not above board computer and phone stuff at the time as well. Yeah, so I ended up doing a lot of the mechanical work for my dad's design business. And so that would usually mean taking his art direction to create things like an ad. And so he did a lot of print stuff. And I started helping him and his clients pull together really early stage web pages. And so, this was back in the day where you still did a lot of like tables with invisible pixel images to cut, to basically lay things out, a lot of image maps for linking, that type of stuff. And when I ended up going to actually apply to Art Center College of Design, which is down in Pasadena, really great art school on the West Coast, I brought in a zip disk of all of my commercial art. And they had to like ask someone to find someone to bring a zip disk out. And they asked where all of my sketches and my sculptures were. And I just made it very clear that I was not a fine artist, I was a commercial artist. And so maybe at that point, that's when I realized that going into design was not necessarily my calling at that point. And so I ended up going to Boston University for their College of Engineering and did a computer systems engineering degree, which is really a halfway between computer science and computer engineering. So we would learn things like VLSI design, like how do you lay out chips, how do you actually build logical gates, all that type of stuff. But we'd also do a lot around, say, 3D programming or cryptography and more of the algorithmic side of computer science. When I was graduating from Boston University, I was, I interviewed at a few different places, mostly as hardware engineering roles, like places like Motorola at the time, General Dynamics, stuff that was, maybe a little bit more focused on security, hardware, that type of thing. But I also interviewed at Microsoft. And that was when I was, for whatever reason, and I'm not exactly sure to this day why, but I was put in program manager interviewing circuit rather than an engineering circuit. And so, it was a very different way to think about things. And so, some of my senior year classes were about pulling together a lot of information to build out a full project. And a lot of that really interested me. So how do you try to decide what things you're building? How do you work on a project end to end? How do you plan for that whole project? I really was interested in. And so one of the questions that they asked during the interview that I think really sold me on the role as well was asking, what would, if I were to design a washer-dryer combination for someone that was sight impaired, what types of questions would I ask, and what types of things would I do to design for them? And the answer is not really important, but I mean, it's really that building of empathy where you're trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes to really understand what is the task they're trying to get done. How can you aid them in doing it better, or doing it in a way that's simpler, or just in the end maybe make them happier or better off in their life in some way. And so that's when I ended up going to Microsoft as a program manager in the Silicon Valley campus, which is just down the street from Google. This was around the time in the Silicon Valley area where Microsoft was still considered the evil empire. And so while doing a lot of outreach, I definitely I enjoyed socializing within the kind of network of people, tech people within the Bay Area, it was still challenging because I was a Microsoft person. So I ended up being there for about 7.5 years, working on a lot of different projects, including Hotmail. One of the things that I tried to at least help Hotmail figure out or warned Hotmail about was Gmail. And that totally blew up the entire model of everybody like constantly ratcheting down space for your email. But I did a lot of very interesting things around backend tools and data warehousing for Hotmail. And so looking at how usage patterns changed after those types of things was really interesting to see. And it's very much like an inflection point for their business. I ended up working on a lot of other stuff, including like desktop search, gadget platform. I do have a Windows Vista ship it somehow, which I don't show off to everybody. And then ended up running a group as a lead program manager called Windows Live Gallery, which was really a proto app store. So you could find things like emoji and emoticon. We called them emoticons at the time, not emoji. But emoticons, you could find avatars for your MSN Messenger or Windows Live Messenger. But what was most interesting were these gadgets that were available for not only your desktop or your live, like kind of your front page that you'd go to on live.com, but also hardware ones and a bunch of other platforms. But this was, probably one of the things that I had always heard Bill Gates had said was that we would never host other people's software. And that was something that we ended up doing with Windows Live Gallery. So not that I blatantly disobeyed Bill Gates or anything like that, but building the case internally for Microsoft doing something that was potentially very uncomfortable for them, and building this type of app, app store essentially for these things that bridge the Windows Live, and Office brands. It also meant that I spent a lot of time on antitrust calls because of the cross-play between Windows Live, Windows, and Office. It was really an amazing experience. I mean, I think we ended up running, the program manager team ended up helping a team of about 50 total that included engineering, QA, operations, and customer support team for doing approvals. At that point, I ended up leaving Microsoft to join a startup as a content platform evangelist or a tech evangelist, working for a place called Dash Navigation, which was really the first GPS device that was connected via cellular modem. And so you could do a lot of live services through this hardware device. This was kind of a year or two before the iPhone really came out. And so I ended up not only helping understand the program management side of, well, in that case, I was more of a product manager stuff side. But how do you build the right type of platform so people can build interesting things on top of this device, but also going out there and really evangelizing the idea that connected services deserve to be in the car. And so it's a very interesting role. And that's probably that started me down the path towards business development. And so after that, ended up getting laid off for the first time ever from that company when they were running out of money, and worked as a official business development person for a company. When I ended up getting laid off from there because they were running out of money, I ended up starting my own business, and that was called Complete Seating, which was a restaurant reservation site service for kind of like a competitor of OpenTable. Most of the focus was in San Francisco, but we had paying customers, I think about 15 paying customers. And my role was really around the product side, strategy, but I also spent about a third of my time doing development. And had a really amazing technical co-founder, Hubert, who I still, talk to a lot. And, really probably one of the best experiences that I had. Unfortunately, that didn't work out either. There's probably we could probably do a whole thing just about kind of lessons learned from that. But it's still something that I'm probably the most proud of, but also was the most painful to end up shutting down. So when I was looking around, when I was kind of winding down Complete Seating, I ended up getting a role at Waze as a business development person. And so that first started focusing on getting local TV stations to use Waze on air during their morning broadcasts, which is a really great crossover. They are talking to people about traffic, and then people are getting into their car and then not thinking about the TV station anymore, and vice versa. We want to get people, once they're in the car after they've been thinking about traffic, we want them to start using Waze. And so that was a program that they had partnered with one group in LA. I ended up growing up to about 26 different stations nationwide, and then parlayed that into programs with various like city, state, and national level DOT programs. But anyways, it was a really great growth engine for Waze, right? Like when I started, I think we were at 7 million people worldwide. When I ended up leaving, it was about 50 million. I definitely wasn't all because of me, but I could definitely say that program helped. And so what was interesting about that role is this was, again, that hybrid role of doing product management as well as business development. And this, was a talk I did during I believe, 4th season of the Product Mentor, was focusing on kind of like how BD and product management really are kindred spirits. They focus on trying to understand why things need to happen. They need to deal with prioritization and resourcing. It's just that for product managers, it's usually for people around the people that work at that company, whereas business development has the ability to be able to create things between multiple companies. And there's definitely differences, but I think there's a lot of similarities too. And so anyways, ended up moving to Hong Kong, worked for an incubator in the Horizons group, which was a VC that invested in Waze and a bunch of other companies as director of product. And then ended up moving to New York, did some consulting with a couple different companies. I worked for Kayak for a little while in kind of again, BD and product hybrid role. But most recently, I've really just, figured out that I've missed product. And I think it's much easier for a product person to do BD-like work than it is for BD people to do product-like work. Just because no one trusts BD people, it feels like, at least from the product side. So I think that's why this really great role ended up being found by Philosophy, and so that's really where I am today. I think the really amazing thing about the role I have as a senior product strategist here at Philosophy is that we do think so much about the tools that we use and the process that we use that, I think there's a lot of people that are in the agile or lean world that give lip service to this idea of retros and constant learning, but nothing really changes from, and so I've done at least 4 or 5 different postmortems within the group for projects that we've taken on. And just doing an inventory of the different tools or processes that we've tried out, it's at least 5 new processes that we've tried out every single engagement. And some of those worked out really well. Some of them were very helpful. Others didn't necessarily do what we had hoped that it would. And so maybe that's one of those things that I think is really key about being a great product manager, is really trying to understand all of the different tools that you have available to you, and what are the pros and cons of using those tools? When is it appropriate to use those tools? And so that's something that we really focus a lot in the product practice at Philosophy. The person that there were a lot of really great people at Microsoft. And so Dane, Heather, there are a bunch of other people. I think the person who really spent the most time working with me was Liz Yang at Microsoft, and she was the GPM for my team. And I think the thing that really, there are 2 sides to this. So the first thing was that she really, truly cared about the development of my career. And I think that's something that, after having other managers, finding someone that really cares about growing people, it's a lot harder than you'd think, unfortunately. And so I think she showed me the way that you could be a very caring manager, but also one that gives you feedback and makes sure that you're doing the right thing, right? So that was part of it. And then the other part was that, she was a very experienced engineer. And so she had actually worked in Bell Labs for a little bit, and she was like an old school, knew her shit type of engineer, and worked with a lot of different types of product people. And when she made the move over to product management, we had actually worked together on projects where I was a more junior product manager and she was a more senior dev manager, basically. And so I think all of the fact that she had that alternate experience from the other side, I think was really valuable to be able to grow myself as a product manager as well, or a program manager at Microsoft, but maybe I'll stop bringing that up. Yeah, so I think that was really key, is having that alternate experience of looking into product management and seeing what she needed as a development manager was really, really helpful to me. And I think this also relates to the fact that, when I was working for her, I ended up becoming a lead program manager or product manager as well, and ended up managing my own people. And so I think, that idea of being someone on the other side, I think is really applicable when it comes to management as well. So, I ended up becoming a manager between a manager of managers and then individual contributors. And so having her to really help guide me through that experience was really, really, really helpful. But I think also in the end, something that she really imparted in me were a lot of really interesting career lessons from the standpoint of being a manager. Think about how you would actually be a better employee so that you can understand what you expect out of the relationship with your individual contributors. But then also, I think there's a lot around the reality of the situation within corporate circumstance. And so kind of how do you work on things like promotions in reality, right? And this was the time that Microsoft was still doing a lot around stack ranking and kind of, the different percentage pools for different people. And so even though I'm really bad at political aspects of corporate, wading through the corporate structure, that's something I'm very bad about. I kind of have a problem with authority in general. And so I think having her as my guide for this she was a very pragmatic guide. I mean, she cared, but she also wanted to make sure I understood the reality of the situations that I was dealing with. And so I think she was incredibly helpful in that particular case. And I definitely, have loved working with her. The reason why I originally wanted to become a product manager was really because I think, and this is maybe where product management has changed over the last 15 years that I've been doing it. And so when I first got into it, I really, something that I even did when I was a kid was one of the things I loved to do would just sit around and plan how a lemonade stand would work on paper. And so it's this idea of trying to think about the problem space overall, like how does this system work? How does this organization work? How do I try to plan for this thing to be successful? I think is really within the core of what a product manager does. Now, when I first started at Microsoft, and I just responded to Steve Sinofsky about this, who is a VP at Microsoft and he blogs a lot on Medium about this type of thing. But we would write really large specs, and we would do a very much waterfall style process. And I think initially, when it was a product manager's job, was really to try to be as creative as possible in understanding all the edge cases, and then either mitigating them or understanding that they were there, and then constantly making this doing this horse trading trade-off while the whole machine ratcheted down towards this release point. And so this is maybe where I think also, I think maybe one of the things that's thankless about being a product manager is that if the project is unsuccessful, I feel like it tends to hang on the product manager's shoulders a bit more than anybody else's, because why didn't they think about that? I think when you get into agile teams, it's less about that, right? When you get into agile teams, balanced teams, lean teams, it's less about the product manager did not see this coming, and so that was a problem. But back then, when it was waterfall, if you didn't write it in your spec, and the engineers didn't estimate it correctly, that was the 1 cent fix that you could have done in the spec is now a $10 problem that you just released, basically. And so I think that's where a lot of this comes from. And so initially, I was really motivated by trying to understand these whole systems and trying to understand all of the different ways that it could possibly work. And this was a very imaginary and creative activity for me. And so I think it linked that a lot of this design thinking that I had before with the concepts around technology. And so that's probably what motivated me at first, really, around product management. I think as time has gone on, product management has kind of reinvented itself for me a couple different times. And probably the most recent one has really been around the fact that, because we try to build these things for such complex systems now, you definitely don't know everything. And if you assume you do, you're wrong, right? And if you don't in some way plan for the unexpected, and even, I guess maybe it's not plan, but it's brace for the unexpected, because it's going to happen, right? If you're not able to deal with ambiguity, if you're not able to deal with the unknowns of the world, then being a product manager is a lot harder. And so I think that's maybe something that I've really focused on an awful lot, is trying to understand how I can be better at ambiguity. How can I be better at embracing uncertainty? How do you actually prioritize things based on the fact that you don't know everything? And so that's been a lot of this practice within philosophy, is how do we focus a lot on unknowns rather than the knowns up front? And so we use frameworks like Cynefin, a couple other types of voting techniques, a bunch of different research techniques that I really love that I think have helped me do this. So yeah, I mean, I definitely did not get into product management because at Microsoft, I was going to be writing like a 500-page spec that translated an RFC into something that could be translated into Hotmail for integration with Outlook and Exchange. I did not get into product management for that. But a lot of that like creative problem solving, I think, is what really has always interested me. I think maybe my biggest product regret is not doing my own thing enough. So, I mean, I think I really have, I've been able to find really great teams. But there are probably a couple roles where I would have been better off actually just doing anything that was my own idea than it was to work there. And so, you know, I think like it's not that I didn't learn anything. Like I think it's always important to be learning things. But the things I learned were things that I would almost consider bad habits to a certain extent, or distrust, right? And so I think like, I don't know, I feel like it's not necessarily trusting my gut more, because I feel like in some ways I'm a very optimistic person. So my gut tries to be more optimistic than reality, probably. And I think product managers need to be a little bit optimistic as well. So maybe that's why I'm inclined towards this work. But, you know, I think being a month or two into a role where, or maybe even like 3 months, like trying to really give it a fair shake and just realizing that this is just a really bad role and like it's a bad organization or it's just a bad fit for me, I should cut and run way faster than I did in the past. And I can think of 2 reasons. I'm not going to call out which 2 companies that was, but there are 2 very specific cases where after about 3 months, I just knew it was a shitty place to be. And so I should have just left, and I should have even just erased it off of my resume. And I should have just done anything on my own, and just that would have been way better. So that's maybe my biggest regret, is that I don't quit fast enough. I try to really hang in there too much. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely talking to people, and the research that we do, I think, really inspires me the most. I mean, you know, I'm definitely very strongly opinionated. And so learning something new from someone almost every day about the way that they think about the world is so inspiring. And I think it could be very daunting. Like one way I could look at it is that I know nothing, right? And that I will never know everything. But I think the right way to look at it is that the world is so interesting, right? That there are so many problems to solve that there's no way we can solve all of them. And so I think that's just like, that's inspiring, that we always have work to do. There's always some way that we can make people's lives better. And I think that like the research is really what brings it home for me. So being able to talk to these people on pretty much, I mean, we do research on a weekly basis when we're in an engagement. So at least, you know, we try to do at least 3 to 5, if not more, people per week whenever we're doing an engagement. And so I think that's very inspiring to me. I think also the people I work with are really, you know, smart and talented. And so I think like being able to finally kind of like, you know, the last couple roles that I've had weren't really a great fit for me from like the standpoint of like a culture fit or a fit of like a team organization. And so working in a place where it's like, oh man, this is like amazing work that I get to do every day, and I get to do it with people that I have a lot of respect for and really enjoy working with. I think that's probably the part that really inspires me the most about a lot of this. I think from maybe a more academic sense is that at Philosophy, because we do focus so much on the practice of product, being able to really geek out about that type of stuff. So like, you know, the Cynefin framework is one of those things where I think, you know, people have like probably read something about it and then they've said, oh, this is like cool, but I don't know, I don't even know how to apply this to what I do on a regular basis, right? So being able to work in a team where people are open to that type of experimentation and have that mindset that everything we do this week may not work out, right? Like it may be totally wrong, but at least we will have learned something about not only the product that we're working on, but also we've learned something about how to do better product in the future. So that like meta aspect of like product process, something I love kind of like investigating and understanding, but constantly evolving as well. I think the worst thing ever is the people that come in and say that this process always works, right? Like I for some reason, whenever someone says that to me, I suddenly like lose a little bit of like trustworthiness on their ability to do product. But I think that's the problem. That's the problem with like, you know, interviewing product managers as well, is that, you the reality is probably the right answer to every interview question is the first step is it depends. And then after that, you're giving like examples of times where it worked out one way or the other, right? So anyways, I think like that ability to really expand the amount of stuff. And so, philosophy also thinks a lot about us doing our own stuff. So I had just done a post about a new canvas that we've been trying out for strategic thinking. And so how do you link really the high level to the low level? And how do you avoid a lot of the common pitfalls in strategy? And when I say strategy, I mean like strategy with a capital S. And so, being able to work in a team that is willing to experiment on something that is really unproven, right? But also really supporting me in a way that, they've listened to me do talks about it. They've worked on projects. People have come up to me and given me some really amazing feedback on how it either worked or didn't work within their projects. So again, that experimentation, that kind of trust that we're always trying to move things forward has been just amazing and very inspiring. I think like the thing that, the person that probably is most interesting to me is, I can't remember the name of the person right now, but is this person who does UN emergency response. And so he basically is the development manager for response at the UN. And so he's the type of person that when Ebola was really spreading in Africa in 2016, it's like his job to figure out what to do to help that. Or like when Haiti had their problems with the earthquake and everything, like it's his job to go in and really try to understand like what can he do to actually make the situation better, right? And that's not something that's as simple as it sounds. And I think that's why it's so interesting and it's such an amazing job to me is that, he's really, there are definitely product managers that deal with life and death situations. Okay, those are product managers usually that work for medical or certain types of government programs or things like that. But the reality is like the person who's building Snapchat, they're probably not dealing with life and death other than maybe helping avoid stalkers or something like that, right? So to me, it's like this person who really is doing essentially product management, but for like people's lives. It's just really amazing, and I think has got to be very rewarding work. It's got to be very difficult though, because when we talk about making trade-offs between working on this thing or that thing, right? And we talk about how we do estimation or how do we decide where to pay things when we're building a product, like I just can't even imagine the type of difficult decisions this person has to make. And so I think understanding how that person actually works, how they make those decisions is incredibly important to me. And then I think also like, how do they continue to keep their humanity in all this is probably the most difficult thing, right? Because, when we talk about empathy, and there's been a bit of a backlash the last month or two on Medium about empathy and like how empathy is used in technology. But, how do you still kind of keep an understanding that these are real people that you're dealing with and that you're actually helping in some way? Like they're already hurting in some way, right? Like, how are you actually helping them? How are you making their lives better in a way that is very substantial and may not always be as long-term as you'd like it to be, right? Because things like aid to Haiti or stopping the spread of Ebola, those are things that are helpful for now, like this particular disaster. But it's not really speaking to the fact that, like, how do you now hand this off to another team that worries more about the ongoing development of these areas, right? Like, how do you build infrastructure in places? This is something that my sister actually works in Kenya for an NGO. And so, I've been trying to pitch her organization on doing some pro bono work from philosophy. How do we apply technology, but in a way that's interesting? So for example, like, they don't have, smartphone penetration in places like Kenya is actually pretty small, but feature phones are really popular. In fact, like a lot of the way people do payments today is really just a fancy way of sending phone minutes between people. So anyways, like, I think that to me, that's why I've always had this pull that, like, when you start to try to understand people a lot, when you try to really get into people's heads to understand who and why they do things, I think ideally it doesn't make you cynic. Right. And so I think like that person that works at the UN, he's got to be the least cynical person, or at least I hope he is the least cynical person ever, because he's the person that's really like making these great change in life. And so I don't know, I would love to hear and see how his thought process works. Like, how does he work with the people? Because I'm sure that he works in a very high stress type of situation. right? Like understanding all of the different ways that he upkeeps his own self, I think is one of those very interesting questions I have. Because, you know, in very stressful situations, even for product people, I feel like product people take a lot of brunt of the team's like anger and like concern and just stress in general. And so, you know, I talk to a lot of different product people. It seems that some of the product people I talk about are more likely to be into mindful practice and meditation and stuff like that, or anger management. So maybe we're just all broken people. Maybe that's what it is. That's why we get into product management. But I think, like, you know, understanding how he keeps himself healthy, right? Like, I think is another thing that I think would be like amazing and interesting to understand. One of the current projects we just worked on was for PricewaterhouseCoopers. And I can't talk about a lot of the specifics necessarily, but the specifics I can talk about is it's essentially a B2B service, right? And it's focused on how do you help people essentially organize their workday. And so the thing that's probably most exciting to me about this is, again, we're talking about people that do service jobs. So these are, you know, repairmen, like AC repairmen, gas station repairmen, people that fixed vending machines, like all that type of stuff, right? And so, you know, when I was in high school, I worked in construction a little bit. I did lawn care, I think is what we called it. And so, like, you know, I did some of those things, but I didn't ever really go into any of the service industries that are, you know, effectively are like IT today, but for like physical devices that exist in our world, right? But they're not sexy physical devices. They're an AC machine. And so I think being able to talk with them and being able to ride along with them was really interesting, because, you know, one of the people that I ended up riding with was actually an electrician. And, you know, he is like way geekier than I am, but he's working in this industry that, you know, does not get the right type of, you know, they're not observed as being geeky, right? But this guy had, like, you know, the craziest Android setup, and, you know, he just was like, he knew a lot of stuff, and so I think just understanding, again, like I think that's what it's, again, getting back to what excites me about the job day to day is this is research, right? In this particular case, it was learning about a particular type of role that, you know, I've had, like, you know, Verizon people stop by and install my cable, right? And just chatting with them a little bit was very interesting. But we got to be able to spend like a week or two of time doing ride-alongs, like seeing the type of conditions these people have to work with, looking at the data and the tools that they actually have to use today. And again, it's just like, how do they actually do their job with some of the tools and some of the chicken wire and bubble gum that they've pieced together for these tech solutions, but they make it work, right? And that's maybe that's what inspired me about that particular job, again, is that, and this gets back to a real tenet of job to be done, which I'm a big fan of as well. But like, job to be done is really about, you know, if you see pieced together solutions, that's where there's a real opportunity for a product, because this person went out of their way to like take this product and this tool and this other piece of hardware, and they're using them together, which is very clunky to use these three things together, but it solves whatever that problem is that they need to get done. And so observing these people in the field, like, it is so much that. Like, there are so many things where, you know, they have like an app, but they also have email, and then working with the people, they have these like printers in their trucks, and, you know, it's just like, just mind-boggling. Like, I don't even know, we have like it's like a joke in philosophy. It's like, is the printer working today? We have no idea, because we haven't had to print anything for like weeks or something like that. So, so it's just like, it's like that type of thing where, again, for a while, I would try to always be a couple generations back on mobile phones whenever I was really doing a lot of mobile stuff. And I think that was my, like, forcing myself to still work on things that probably the general public was using. So again, it's very interesting to be able to see that, and exciting. And I think the good thing is that some of the stuff we found out was really like no duh type of stuff, right? But you need to do it, right? Like, you need to go out and actually do this no duh stuff. But then there were other things where there's actually some really interesting things that we had learned that probably were not top of mind right away. And it was more about the social interactions that actually happen between these different people. And so in our case, you know, we use personas at Philosophy, but we use them more in like a job persona or like a, you know, a job role persona, rather than, you know, this is Tom and he's 34 and eats tuna fish and has a truck. Like, those types of personas don't matter. Okay, I think I think they're bullshit, if you'll pardon my French. But like there's a persona called Joe, who's this field tech worker. And these Joes talk to each other an awful lot, right? Like they'll call each other when they have a problem. There's all this information that's being shared between them. And then there's also Jack, who's like this very senior Joe. And so just seeing how this actually works on site was really, really interesting. And it was something that if you just like asked them about it, they probably would never talk about this, right? So yeah, that was really interesting for me. Status reports. I don't think there's anything that I like less than giving status. I think there's definitely ways that you can do this. We tend to take an approach of, and we're constantly experimenting with this at Philosophy as well. But I do believe that the code that is checked into Git and the Trello board that we have, and then these artifacts like a user experience, like a user journey, personas, and a strategy, like that's the current state of the product. Like if you can't get anything from those things, you probably are. You need to ask like a specific question, right? And so, like I just think there have been so many times, and Microsoft was probably the worst of this, but at smaller companies I've had it really bad too, where there's this meeting that lasts 2 hours, and it's basically just people going around the table and just riffing on what they've done, and not even in a stand-up way, but in like they're giving way too many details. No one needs to know most of this, right? So it's just like status reports, status meetings, anytime where like I have to try to generate one of these, it like pains me internally to actually write it. We have to do them though in certain cases, like especially in the consulting business, when we want to make sure our product owner on our like client side is successful. We need to make sure they're getting stuff that they can now show to everybody internally. We need to make them look good, right? So there's been this like interesting thing about like, how do I build or create artifacts that are really great for them to show off internally, but are not like soul killing for us to do on a regular basis. So that's maybe it. And I think like we've tried to take a different approach about it too. We have a stand up every day at Philosophy at 10 a.m. And the latest like incarnation of this is, and we're a fairly small team here in New York. We're probably like, I think like almost 14 people. But that's big for a stand-up, right? If you were just do a traditional stand-up, that would take like 45 minutes or something like that, or a half hour. And so what we've brought it down to is that we just do a check-in, which is, what are you bringing to Workday from an emotional or mental standpoint? And so some of that is work. Like it could be, I've just been really thinking about getting this work done, right? But it could also be like, my kid threw a tantrum today, and so I'm like on edge a little bit. Or it could be, I had a really relaxing weekend, and so I'm just like excited to get to work. And it really allows all of us to connect, which is what those things are meant to do. It gets us all on the same page, even though we're all working on different projects, right? So maybe it's more consulting industry specific. But I think like it really builds this type of camaraderie in the team and trust in the team, that we're all being real with each other, right? Like, why is Chris acting this way today? Oh, well, during the check-in today, he was saying that his kid threw a tantrum. So if I act like I'm throwing a tantrum, maybe he'll have like post-traumatic stress disorder around this particular thing, and he'll flash back to that. But I think like that's the thing, is that it's more about like connecting to the people on your team. And so I think that's actually, to me, that's the status report done right, because it's in person, it's short, it's about us personally, about how we all interact. But it's not about like the state of the project. You want to go see the state of the project, go run the code. Like, that's the state of the project. Probably the most that I like is really, again, that research, right? Getting back to the research that I do on a regular basis, I mean, just being able to understand more about the way the world works. And I think in particular, how I can understand the way the world works to be a more effective person. That is absolutely something that I love about product management. I think in addition to that, I'm a really big fan of helping people make hard decisions. And so that's only something, talking about that prioritization or trade-offs really gets down to why product management exists. And so maybe we're also kind of psychologists, like that decision-making. Like when I first started doing independent consulting as a product manager without a team. And so there's really only two ways that you can do this type of thing. Like, one is that you're actually embedded with the team for X amount of weeks or months, and you're there every day, and that's like your main gig for a little while. Or you're kind of doing a little bit of research, or like someone wants a spec of something, like, so you're doing this kind of like part-time product management work, which is kind of bad. And I would even include like, how do you help people get like strategic alignment or like prioritization of what to build next? But those things, that like weird like part-time stuff, it really is just therapy sessions. That's really all it is. Because all you're doing is like, generally you'll have like 3 or 4 founders in a room, and they're like, we need a product manager, we need some help. And they're like, yeah, well, he tried this, and she tried that, and none of this is working. And like, I just want you to tell them what you told me on the phone, and like blah blah blah. Like, it's like couples therapy, but with like a polyamorous relationship. And so so I think one of the things that I enjoy doing is I like, I do like I love listening to people, and I like trying to understand where they're coming from. I think the part that's a balance, and that's always like an interesting thing for me to try to figure out, is how do I keep that balance between listening versus being solution oriented. And it really depends on, I think there's like a weird mindset mood thing that I have, because sometimes I'll be very solution oriented, sometimes I'll be very focused on kind of like listening to the problem. But I think that's the other thing that really inspires me about this, is that like with your own team, you are doing that job every day, right? Like with your own customers, you're doing that job every day. With the people that you work for, you're doing that for every day. And so understanding those people, and that's maybe something where we don't provide enough empathy, or think about in an empathetic way. And I think consulting does this a lot, is that we don't necessarily always think about the person that we're consulting, right? Like, why do they need this? And it's not necessarily just because they want to build something, right? Like that's a byproduct of really what we're trying to do. Because truth is that they just want to build something and just build it, right? The problem is that they can't because of some reason. And so that's why I think product management consulting, or just like innovation consulting in general, when you start to get meta enough about it, it turns into organizational consulting. And so I don't know. I think I'm definitely not at that level where I enjoy that type of organizational consulting stuff. But at the very least, understanding, what are the kind of like concerns and anxieties that people on my team have, and how do I help them be more effective? How do I get them to feel great about the work they're doing? Really is like very important to me, and I try not to be a dad about it all the time, but like I definitely think about like caring about the people that I work with. And so that's just very, just feels good, I guess, is the right way to put it. Some of the advice that I would give to people trying to get into product management is that there's not really any one thing that you need to have been to be a product manager, right? I think the part of what really makes product managers very effective is the fact that they do have a breadth of experience. And it's not always that you're trying to do things like pattern matching in product management. That's maybe one tool that product managers have. So like the idea of system thinking is actually very helpful when trying to, when you're doing, say, research, or you're doing experimentation, being able to see that this particular thing worked well in this other industry and trying it out in the one that you're actually working in, I think is very powerful. And so I think what's really important is that you learn as much as you can from every role that you have, and then think back to it whenever you're in that next role. So that would be one piece of advice I would give. Is like, there's not like, yes, you can go to product schools. There's different, programs that you can use to learn about the specifics of product management. But I think the people that are most successful in product management are the ones that leverage all of the experience they have, rather than, knowing the the whole lean manual or the whole agile manifesto. Like, those are the people that are not necessarily successful, right? Like that doesn't matter as much. I would say the other thing is too, is really learning how to make trade-offs and work with the team with those trade-offs, I think, is very key. And so one of the things that I think I see with a lot of junior product managers, and at Microsoft, I mean, they invest so much into their program managers. They have boot camps every year. They have trainings all the time. We even would kind of jokingly say that a program manager is not worth anything for the first 2 years of their lives at Microsoft. And so I think it's that the whole thing about that experience, though, is that you don't always know the right answer. You're really just applying your mindset to the product or to the project that you're working on. And the best thing that you can do around that is you can really provide this framework or this decision around trade-offs in priority. I would say that's the other thing. And generally those really young product managers that don't have a lot of experience, they tend to think that that decision is only theirs and that they are the one that's supposed to make it and then just move forward. But the reality is that things are changing constantly, and that you actually don't know everything. And if you really believe in something like Agile, you assume that you in the future knows more than you now, right? And so it's that constant discussion with not only your teammates, but also looking back that really maybe people don't think about. They're maybe stuck in the moment now about how do they make that decision, rather than trying to understand where they exist within the context, not only of their organization or their team, but also within the context of the history that they're actually trying to move forward. It's very tough to get into product management because they want people, depending on the role they're going after, they want to see experience in product management, right? But you can't really become a product manager without getting experience. And so the way that the advice that I've at least given to people that are trying to make the jump, say, from engineering or QA or even business development into product management, is that there are a lot of things that you can do within your job that are product management like. And so, if I was just talking to someone that works on QA, right? And so even though I'm kind of on the fence about whether QA should exist anymore when we talk about things like, writing unit tests, all those things around test-driven development and continuous deployment, things like that. But anyways, the point is that within QA, they still have to build out tools, right? Like they still need to have process, and they still need to constantly evolve that to be able to be as effective as they can be within the team context. And so the idea of, well, what do the people on your team need to do? So doing that type of user interviewing, which I think is within the realm of product management, learning what the people that you work with need, right? Like that's something that's a very core skill to product management. Prioritizing what things you build based on importance rather than urgency. That's something that you really need to have that's core. And so for that QA person, the things they provide to their team, the fact that they're able to make the real, the product manager that's actually working on the product, making their job easier by making QA run as efficiently as possible, that allows them to put on their resume that they did a lot of product manager-like stuff, right? I think the other thing too is that you can also ask for responsibility within your organizations that do not make you a product manager, like in title, but that still do a lot of the things. So like the basics around project management, while they're not necessarily 100% within the product management role, it's still important and interesting to understand how those things work, right? Like when you work in somewhere like a balanced team, which is something that we really believe in a lot of philosophy, engineers are very much supposed to sit in on user research and even help conduct user research if it makes sense, right? Or they're supposed to help make prioritization decisions, So I think the best way you can do that is look at the role you're in right now and try to imagine what a product manager would do in that role and then do those things. And gaining that experience, to me, is the most important thing. We interview product managers, what we call the product strategists at Philosophy, but they're basically product managers with some slight differences. And so, I look a lot at people that have not necessarily had traditional product manager roles. I would rather see someone that has a great learning mindset, someone that has actually tried to help a team be better at what they do, has done things like user research. Those are the things I really look for. I look for the components of a product management role rather than necessarily just a pure product management type of position in their past history. So that's probably my advice to breaking into product management, is that there's so many opportunities to do product management work in your role right now. Definitely, they should be listening a lot. I think the worst product managers I've ever met will usually come in as a product manager and say, okay, here's the process I've used. It works. I'm just going to go for it. And they just change everything, right? The reason why that's bad is that you don't understand the history or the context of the organization, right? There's a reason why people do things. Even if it's a really bad way to do things, there's a reason why they do it. And so the first day, you're getting to know people, you're maybe getting Wi-Fi access. So that's kind of a wash day. You know what I mean? You're trying to figure out how to sign up for your 401k potentially if you're lucky enough to work for an organization like that. But the first week, it should really just be about you're meeting all your team members. You're meeting people that are ancillary to your team members, right? You're probably being sent tons and tons of documents that may or may not be actually helpful or up to date. You should have already been using the product that you're going to be working on. You should have already been using your competitor products. I think getting to talking to real users as soon as possible, I think is really important for that first week or so. So like, I think this is where in organizations I've run, if we do have, say, customer support, I think it's really important for people to like temp in customer support if it's a separate organization. I think that's really valuable. I think there's a lot of stuff that's out there that you actually don't know is valuable, or the team doesn't know that it's valuable from like a document or from a information standpoint. So the way that I've looked at that is I've tried to make some type of small change or make some type of small discovery within the first week or two. And usually getting from end to end of that discovery or change, you have to run through the gauntlet of everybody to a certain extent. So I think like it doesn't have to be big. And I'm not saying that like you're going in and you're just like trying to just change everything. But like there's probably an idea that you have that you want to try out. And ideally your organization is accepting of that type of thing. And if it's not, you should be working on that. Like you're getting people into the habit of experimenting and to trying things out. And it's that combination of like figuring out what is the information that people think. This is like, again, gets back down to the very interesting thing around sense making and like the way people are, is that you could ask me to write down everything I know about a topic, and I would only write down probably a very limited amount that I know about a particular topic, right? The problem is that it's like the Oracle. You have to ask the right questions to get all of the information out, right? And so the times that I think are most interesting are like, one, talking to customers, and two, trying to get something done in the organization. That will tell you so much about the way the organization works, the way the product gets things done, like information that people don't think is important, but that you actually need to ask to actually find out, rather than then just writing something down. So that's like the first couple weeks. I think the other thing that is important is that if your team is not doing retros on a regular basis, and I think, you know, we do retros on like a weekly basis, and some people feel like that's maybe too frequent. We try doing it every 2 weeks, but it's still, we try doing a certain type of retro every month and a different type of retro every month, alternating every 2 weeks. And it wasn't right. Like it just didn't feel right. We're still tweaking our retro. Like, you know, the traditional retro I think works great. And so I would just do that. But like getting into a habit of doing a retro at least every month, if not every other week, ideally every week, because you can really make constant change that way. You can also tell when a problem is not being resolved, right? Like, I think that type of retro schedule is something that's not, if it's not being done in your organization, you should start doing it as soon as possible. So that's more like, once you've gotten acclimated, you maybe have started to build some trust with the team, you can start to introduce the idea of like retros and stuff like that. Yeah, that to me, those are kind of like the main things that I would do. I think it's always different depending on the industry as well. But again, just recapping, like, you know, first step is really trying to get to talk to your customers as much as possible, as early on as possible. Try to ship something with the company, or try to get something done with the company as soon as possible. And then just build in mechanisms for feedback. Those are really the main things that I worry about in any role. Mark Williamson was my manager when I was a tech evangelist at Dash Navigation. And so there was one thing that I think is very much related to your question. There's something else that has been really impactful for me too, that he talked about. But the thing that really was the best advice that I think I got that was very succinct was really just, when you go into a meeting or when you go into a discussion, imagine what each person in that room is thinking. And I think this is something where we all get caught up in our own heads too much, and we have like an agenda, or we have a desire, or like an end goal that we're trying to get to, but we're not actually trying to understand that, why is everybody here at this table right now, right? Like, why is everybody in this conversation? And what are the things that they're bringing to the table that are not only their own desires, but also their own biases and things like that. And so it's a very hard skill, because like, I think, you know, part of the reason why humans are not good at complexity is because we have a limit on the number of people that we can model in our heads. But it also is a benefit that we have over other animals, right? Like I think it's the Dunbar number is 150, where you can only understand in a group of 150 how any two people are related to each other. So that's the problem, is that the reason why we can do that is because we can model other people's brains in our heads, right? The problem is that because we work with more than 150 people, potentially, right, or we've interacted with more than 150 people, it gets harder and harder to do that type of modeling. I think that's why like close-knit teams are so interesting, because you actually start to build those models in your head. And so I can, you know, based on the people that I work with, say at Philosophy, if you were to ask me a question, I could answer how they would answer and how I would answer. based on my understanding of their mental models, right? And so I think just getting into that space of trying to understand how everybody is, I think not only allows you to make more effective decisions because you can try to get ahead of maybe something where you are just really thinking from your own standpoint or your own point of view. But I think this is related to the fact too that I try to think like Venkatesh Rao, who's a blogger at Ribbon Farm that I have a lot of respect for. Him and a couple other people I had talked about this, but people that you really respect a lot, that you've read an awful lot about, you tend to have them as like these like idols in your head, and you can always hear what they're saying about what you're doing right now. So I think like, anyways, this is a long way to get back to what Mark Williamson originally told me, which was really just like trying to understand what people are doing and why they're there, and trying to apply that to the situation you have. I think has branched out into all these things for me about also just understanding like mental models in general, like how do you use them to your advantage? Like how do you help set mental models within the room? And there's a lot of techniques for this. Like, I don't know if you've ever heard of I think it's the 6 hats. So like, anyways, 6 hats is really just a way that you can get everybody into the same mental model within a team, within a meeting, so that you don't have like randomness in mental models. Same thing with like, agile is a mental model, but everybody has different concepts. And same thing with balanced team. Like when you talk about how engineers, designers, and product people all work together, they all bring a different mindset to it. And so I think just doing a better job of trying to understand the other people's mindsets, and then working with those mindsets, and even potentially priming mindsets is a really, really interesting thing. And it all stems from that advice that Mark Williamson gave me like a long time ago. The hardest lesson on me, I think, has been that has been more of like an organizational thing. So, getting back to those times where I was at a job for too long, and I think, there's this spectrum of kind of like good organizations versus bad organizations, and those two were probably very heavily on the bad organization side, or bad fit. I think like organization and fit are an interesting cross section, but let's just talk about it as organizations right now. I think one of the hardest things for me, like on me, was really just realizing that organizations are not necessarily there to care about me, right? Like as much as managers talk about caring about people, as much as we have team camaraderie in some way, and I think that's where there's a lot of this like toxic ideal of cultural fit being that you want to go get a drink with someone. Like that doesn't build great teams. But in the end, like organizations, especially ones that are publicly traded, are there at service to their shareholders, right? And not necessarily to their employees. I think good organizations are that way. And that was hard. That was very much like, it for a little while was kind of like a crushing realization. And I think, it made me very sad, first of all, because like, the fact that these organizations don't really care deeply about me necessarily. But I think it also was a little bit freeing. It was kind of cathartic in the sense that, you should really be focusing on what's best for you, right? The reality about organizations is that they have a goal, or they have some type of end state that they're trying to get to, and they're really just renting you for whatever amount of time you allow them to. And you have your own goals, though. And sometimes those goals intersect, and sometimes they overlap, but they don't always, and they shouldn't always, right? And so I think it was a very tough realization, but then ended up being kind of good in a way that it means that I'm much more focused on trying to find the place that I fit the best. Now, as far as the hardest thing for me to learn, is that, again, getting back to that like problem with authority, I think I may come off like a know-it-all sometimes, or like a very aggressive, opinionated person. And so I think that's something that I've had the hardest time trying to figure out how to break. Like I definitely am not a know-it-all. I just want to be very clear about that. Like I don't know everything, as much as it seems like I might. But like it's hard for me to not be very raw with the people I work with, in the sense that like I want to tell them my opinion. I trust them, I love them, but I want to also just be very honest with them. And so I think when it comes to client work, and maybe that's where like consulting is one of those things where I really love the work I do. I love working on all these different projects, all these different engagements, but it's tough because I'm not always like, I almost feel like I need to be adversarial to my clients sometimes so that I can have change in their lives. So I don't know. This has been one of those things that I've been struggling with for years and years, not just in consulting, but just in general, like dealing with other stakeholders within an organization as well. Like, and that probably gets to the whole, like the fact that I'm just so bad at politics within organizations. Like I'm not like the most clueless person in the world, but I'm nowhere near Machiavellian when it comes to this type of stuff. So, but that's the hardest thing to learn, and I still haven't learned it yet. So I'm constantly trying to figure that out. Trying to adopt mindsets that really are helpful towards product management. So I think this really gets back to, there's a pattern that I've been seeing a lot in really effective projects, in the sense that there's divergence and convergence. And so I think that type of mindset within product management is one of those mindsets that, from the very beginning, at the very least, you like the older concept for product management is that at the beginning of the project, you say yes to anything. At the end of the project, you say no to everything, right? And so, you're constantly trying to make sure that you're working on the right stuff, and that there's a certain point where you're allowing new thought and you're not. But I think that ability to understand the mindset I'm in, and try to understand how my mindset impacts my work, that self-realization is very hard, because it can also mean that, I feel things like imposter syndrome. I get depressed about things that I've worked on that haven't gone as well, even if but the thing is like, trying to understand that I do feel depressed or unhappy about something, and why do I feel that way? That kind of like understanding of why you're feeling, I think is one of those things that is really important. And that's very much related to how you adopt mindsets to be able to do the right thing within a project or a product. That's one of those things. I think, like, also, my background, my varied background, the fact that I've had exposure to a lot of different industries, I think has really helped me be particularly effective in product management too. So again, that systems thinking, that was the other half of the thing that Mark Williamson imparted on me, is he talked a lot about system dynamics. And so, I'm more of a converter. I'm more of a converted complex adaptive system person now. But thinking about system dynamics and things like that is really a precursor to getting to that point, I think. But thinking about those systems means that you can be more effective when you jump from industry to industry. And that's especially true when it comes to heuristics or best practices. What is interesting, though, is that it can hurt you in some ways too, because that's like the Dunn-Kruger effect, where people that know very little about something think they know more than they do, and then people that know a lot about something think they know less than they do. This is something I see executives doing all the time when they're trying to apply their thinking in a role or an industry that they don't know. And so I think that self-awareness paired with that system thinking tries to keep me honest in that, yes, this system worked here. Why did it work here? Why could it work here? How do we prove or disprove that it could work here? Rather than just assuming that I know because I've worked in a system like this before. So I don't know, it's like something like that combination, I think is kind of what I feel like has made me successful. The way that I think about personas today is really, it's a reference or a marker or really just an artifact that allows you to really understand the end person that is going to be using whatever you're building, right? And so I think what's really key about these things is that it's supposed to, well, I think there's two things that I really like about personas. One is that it really, it's a shorthand. So rather than saying like, okay, for that field tech worker that is out on the job, that's been there for 30 years, I just say Joe, right? And people know who Joe is. They actually know a lot of nuance about Joe, potentially, but it's just Joe, right? When I write stories, it's not field tech worker, it's Joe, right? So Joe this, Joe that. I think it also personalizes them a little bit more. So like, even though you don't necessarily care about all the details about these personas, like the personas are really more about personalizing this narrative that is that particular role. And so getting maybe into this guts about like what I think are good or bad personas is that I've seen a lot of personas that end up being a fictionalization of someone, and a lot of the attributes that they end up giving to this persona are superfluous or frankly bad for building products, right? So like, again, getting back to that the idea that Tom is a certain age, that's potentially helpful, right? Like saying that they have a dog and that they live in an apartment, like if you're not dealing with dogs or apartments in your role, then it doesn't matter, right? Like if the dog actually matters because Tom is, you're building like a veterinarian site, then the fact that Tom is a dog owner or that they own a old dog, right, is actually interesting. But like the fact that they just own a pickup truck and a dog and they eat tuna fish sandwiches, that doesn't matter most of the time. Good personas, though, it's really about finding a way to personify what happens in the regular day for the people you're building things for. And so it's less about specifics and it's more about kind of like how they think of the world. And so we tend to use them much more as like job-related roles. So it's that this person has some kind of job in general. And so for B2B type of stuff, you're going to find that a job position is a good persona to use, right? So, we have Joe, who's a field tech worker, right? And that there's a lot of different types of field tech workers. Like there's some that focus on plumbing or electrical or AC. So they have a wide range of educations, right? Like they may or may not be good at technology. But unless you're really worrying about any of those different things, it doesn't really matter. It's more about the fact that they have this type of job, right? In our particular case. When it comes to consumers, I think it's still that job to be done style persona, I think is very effective. Like, why is this person using your particular product? And so when it comes to consumer things, it could be, again, showing off to other people is a job to be done, right? And so there could be people that are all about flashiness, and that could be one persona. And then there's someone else that's more about like, they want to make their life easier. That's a different persona. But the details about their lives really don't matter, again, unless you're really specifically targeting that type of information. And so when I said it's an artifact as well, is I think it's something that, one, when you're onboarding new people into the team, it's like the first thing you talk about. What are the first things? Something that should be up on your wall, right? You can always use clip art or fake photos and stuff like that for it, but it's really just more about like the name and kind of that job role that I think is really valuable. Yeah, I see personas done so horribly all the time that it just makes me laugh. Like if it starts turning into like a Dungeons and Dragons sheet about someone, or if it's like, I think there's some interesting stuff I've seen around people doing like Facebook style profiles for personas. But again, if the person is not someone that is interacting via social media, I don't know if it matters. So this maybe gets back to maybe one of those tenets of like product management, is you should always be understanding who your audience is and how your audience is going to be using something. So documenting something can be very valuable if the audience needs it documented that way on that particular topic. If they don't care about that topic, why are you documenting it, right? So I think personas are in the same way, in the same vein, that you should really only be having the information that is really powerful and interesting to the people as a shorthand while they're building products, and helps personify and empathize with those people. Otherwise, I think that the persona can be just a name and a job role almost. I know that there's a lot of people that will disagree with me about that, but I just, based on my experience with them, I've seen a lot of horrible personas created. One of the main things is really around strategy. I think that the product managers really need to understand what the vision of the product is. And there's a lot of different terminology that's out there. Like when we talk about vision or strategy, I think you could definitely, you could say a lot of different ways. Let's just put it that way. But I think understanding what the end goal is really for the project or the engagement or the product allows that product manager to really help kind of set the tone for why we're doing things and keep people on track, right? And I think that is very much related to how you focus on prioritization. And so that focus on prioritization is dependent on you understanding what is really important and not urgent. And I think that's maybe something I was just, I follow a lot of different subreddits about product management. And so there's just one where someone wrote an article about kind of like how to do prioritization within product management. And I think they had a lot of really great points. One of the points that made me bristle a little bit is look at the thing that's on fire or like the broken foot. And the reality is that I think that may be a recipe for doing things that are urgent rather than important. And that is something that I think bad product managers will focus on, the urgent, not the important. And so, yes, your foot may be broken, right? And so the first inclination is to put it in a cast, but maybe you're still in a situation like a bear attack where you should get out of the way. And so, like, I think that's the thing that I worry about, is that being too focused on kind of fixing one little thing that's really, really right now, you're sidestepping all of the world of possibility of how to fix it the right way. And maybe not even the right way. Maybe that's maybe getting too much to the point that you know everything, right? Because you don't. But it's more about trying to take a step back and understand how this plays in the context of the project overall. And so that strategy really helps create that rubric for understanding what is important. And then that prioritization aspect really is that part that you're focusing on as the product manager. So I'd say those two things are really key. I mean, there's many skills. Like I think there was a book that Microsoft Press came out with around like 2007 that was about program management. And the first like chapter was interesting because on one page they had essentially like 30 different attributes about like a good program manager, but product manager in reality. And they had it not only it was 2 columns. And so on one side of the column, it would be something like they're very detail oriented, right? But then it would said on the other side, and also they can see the big picture, right? And then the one below it was something like, they worry about right now, and also they worry about the future. And so it's like there's 30 times 2 like attributes, because maybe let me take a step back here. But what I'm trying to say is that product management is about a lot of different things, but it's also a lot about the duality within those things. So, being able to understand something like strategy is really important, but now being able to apply it to the prioritization of what we're doing this week, I think is that duality, right? So you're looking at this very long-term understanding of what's supposed to happen, and you're applying it to today, versus doing breadth type of search things versus deep dive types of things. This is probably where I've seen product managers that are not as technical do an amazing job because they're able to ask the right types of questions, and they know whether to dive deep or broad. Depending on the conversation. And so again, it's that like duality within product managers that I think good product managers embrace that duality, right? They embrace this fact that they're always going to be thinking about near and far, today and tomorrow, that type of stuff. And I think getting too caught up in one or the other of those things, I think makes you a bad product manager, right? Like if you always just focus on the now, you lose sight of what you have to do tomorrow. So anyways, I think the example that I think is most important though is that strategy versus prioritization. But you could go down the list on anything that a product manager should be able to do, and I think you'll find that type of duality is really important. Pre-mortems, it's a really interesting technique. There was an HBR article that talked about this that I really loved, and I've tried it in a couple engagements that were really tricky engagements, and it really did a great job at what it's supposed to do. And so really a pre-mortem, what it is that before you've started, so generally a post-mortem, right? Something you want to run probably a week or 2 after a project ends, collect a bunch of information, you create a report, and you send it out to everybody so that everybody can learn from it, right? Like that's really the purpose of it, is so everybody can learn. A pre-mortem is where you try to understand how the project will fail ahead of time. And so the reason why this is related to black hatting is that we really this is like creating an exercise by which creative thinking in the most negative way possible is rewarded. And so the way that we've run these is that we will have a group of people, and we've done this both virtually, via Google Hangouts, and we have a tool called .voter app, which is like a way to do voting on stickies, but on a website. So you could do it remotely. But you could do this in person too, where everybody's writing on stickies, right? Or to do, sticky notes, Post-it notes. So what you do, first round, give people about 3 minutes, and what you're setting them up for is that it's 6 months from now, the project has ended, it is a horrible, horrible failure, okay? Like some people in this room have decided to get out of the industry altogether because they're so embarrassed about the project, right? We all have decided to never talk about this project again because it's so horrible. It is like the worst thing that's ever happened. Just imagine the worst thing that's happened to you, and that's what happened on this project, and you never want to work on this project like this ever again. You are just considering about changing careers altogether, right? Like it's horrible, horrible, horrible. You see someone else that worked on this project, you won't make eye contact in the hallway if you see them. Like you just don't want to acknowledge this ever happened, right? So you have that mindset. So now what we think about is like 6 months from now, what do we know about the project that caused it to fail so catastrophically? Okay, and so everybody takes 3 minutes. They write down every reason that it could have failed. Okay, and so in one of the cases that we did this, there were 5 different consulting teams that were all of different specializations that were working together to build one product. Okay, which is a very tough type of situation to be in, because not only is it there's a client-consultant relationship, but there's a consultant-consultant relationship that gets very difficult. And so people will bring up all these different ideas, okay? We take a couple minutes to present all the ideas, all right? We do what's called like affinitize and dedupe. So if two ideas are pretty much the same idea, we'll delete one of them in the virtual board, or we'll like throw away the sticky. And we'll help explain them too. So if, for example, someone wrote something that didn't make any sense to everybody, they'll explain what their thought process was about that horrible case. But so that's really where we're diverging, right? We're allowing for very independent kind of creative thought without biasing each other. This is also, when we talk about the chaotic realm of the Cynefin framework, that's exactly what the chaotic realm is. It's like, it's every person for themselves. And that's why ideation is so interesting at that time. And so anyways, like we have all these stickies, we affinitize and dedupe them. And then we take another couple minutes and we give everybody a certain number of votes, and then they vote. And so in the .voter app, like I tend to do like a ratio of, if there's say like 4 to 5 stickies, I'll give 1 vote, because I want to get like some accumulation and stuff like that. You can do this when you do it physically. It's like those little dot stickers you just hand out to everybody. Everybody looks at all the stickies and they vote on them. And then you basically prioritize based on number of votes. And so you had, you know, again, the divergence of like all the space of possible screw-ups that could happen. And then prioritization of what people think are the possible screw-ups. And then the last round is really like, how do we mitigate these before they actually happen? And so that's a pre-mortem. And I think it's been really interesting. Like in this particular case, the biggest issue was going to be cross-team communication was the biggest concern, and it absolutely was. And as much as we tried, you know, I mean, there were a lot of things we tried to do. It still wasn't amazing, but I think it was better than if we had just gone into it and just said everything was going to be fine. So that's a good example of a pre-mortem. I think it's a really interesting technique. Anytime you're starting a project, I think it's a great idea. The toughest thing, you know, and this is true, I think, across the board when it comes to engineering or any other type of role, but, you know, a lot of the time people end up getting promoted to a role of manager because they're very effective at the job that they do. I think that happens a lot, especially in the technology world. And a lot of the time that's actually a mistake. And so I think the biggest thing when these people are becoming managers, when they're becoming great managers, that they actually need to de-emphasize the fact that they are good at what they do. Right. And so the fact when you're a product manager that's now managing other product managers, it's not your responsibility anymore to go in necessarily and write a spec for something, or to go in and resolve some type of issue between engineering and product management. I think like there's definitely escalation. There's all these other things that come with that about like how do managers deal with issues within an organization. But overall, like you are supposed to be taking a step back now, and your job is actually to make them more effective and then to help plan for their career, right? Your job is not to be a product manager anymore. So I think that's like a very hard thing. And I see that also with sales. Like the difference between a great salesperson and a great sales manager is very much the same as the difference between a great business development person and a great business development manager. And I think in the case of product, BD, and sales, it's even more to the point that you need to step away from actually doing that job in certain cases. I think the things that I really think about a lot when I am trying to set up that relationship with a direct report is about building, I mean, it's basically about building trust, right? Like the reality is that the manager is there to really help provide the space for individual contributors or for those product managers to actually make mistakes in a way that allows them to learn and allows the product to learn. And so there's a certain amount of like protection, depending on how political your organization is, that can be a more complex job. But then the other thing is too, is that building that trust that the person can come to you when there is an issue before it really comes to a head. I think that's also really important. And it's not necessarily that I'm there to fix it, but it's that, you know, the more I know, like the fact that, you know, maybe bad news travels a little bit faster than good news in certain cases. Like it's important that I'm able to, you know, provide that type of protection, but then also just in general, maybe calm them down when they think something really bad happened. The reality is it's not that bad, right? So I think that like trust is something that takes a while to build. Some of the things that I think really matter when building that trust, one, is that if you do find yourself micromanaging them, they will not have a lot of trust for you. So like that stepping back, I think, is a key thing. Another thing that I think is a good mechanism is weekly one-on-ones. And so I think that's something where I've been at different organizations where they either really focused a lot on one-on-ones or they didn't really care about one-on-ones. And when I say they didn't really care, I mean like in the sense that they may still have a meeting every now and then between a direct report and a manager, but it's really more of a status update meeting than it is to try to understand, how should, try to play act through a scenario or talk about how they could have done something better, or just like in general, just vent, right? Like that's the other thing too. And so those one-on-ones, I usually for about an hour a week. I think that time should be considered holy in the sense that, the manager should not be kicking around the schedule all the time. They should not be canceling it. They should do everything possible that they can to make that meeting happen all the time. Because I think that's the other thing too about being a good manager is that you're really leading by example, right? Like that gets back to that point about, by being a manager, what a good employee looks like, because you'll get pissed off if the person doesn't act like a good employee, right? And so it's things like, if you want people to show up on time, right? If you want people to be there early, go in a little bit early. If you want people to ask certain types of questions, you need to ask certain types of questions. So it's really about like that leading by example, and I mean that on so many levels, like, not only just basic behaviors, but even just attitudes or mindsets toward things, I think can really go a long way to helping build great organizations. And that's really the thing, is like any great organization or culture is really just this emergent thing that comes out of the behaviors that you set as process, the people that you hire, and then whatever that strategy is that the organization has. And so your goal there is really to constantly tweak the behaviors that are part of this standard process, right? And that's maybe where there's this tough balance between you and the product manager that you're helping manage. What are the processes that you put in place? You are there as a manager to hire the right people, the people that have a good learning mindset, that are willing to do the right thing for the organization, that aren't all about them. And then the last thing is the strategy. And that's where, as a manager, there's I think it's 7 heuristics of great product management directors. I think it was a post I'd read once. And he is 100% right that you should be a broken record about strategy, right? Like whatever the strategy is, you should know it inside and out. You should be able to recite it to everybody. You should be telling everybody every day what the strategy is. And you should get everybody to be able to recite the strategy back to you. So anyways, that's kind of that trifecta of like great culture within an organization to me. And so managers are really the ones that help set that up for their teams, but also show that as a good example, not only to their people, but to other people within the organization. So that's kind of a bunch of different things that I think about a lot. But I think that the beginning is having a great one-on-one that constantly happens so that you can have that safe space for people to be able to talk freely, right? It's not a status meeting. It's not something where, they're there to prove to you that their job is worthwhile. It's for them to be able to understand their role better, how you help them, and then how you help grow them. I definitely think our team very much practices, there's a great New York Times article about psychological safety within teams, and Google really kind of frontiered that whole approach. But I think that's something that we think about a lot, and especially there's a great article that I probably send to someone at least once a week or once every other week whenever they ask about like what's a great team like. And so it's really this consent, not consensus. And I don't know if you read that before, but it's really great. It's a really great short article, like maybe a 3-minute read. But it really talks about that, great things are not built by everybody agreeing. And the truth is that when you get to consensus, the problem with consensus is that you're making compromise. When the reality is that you need to have the trust between the different roles in a team that someone will make a decision and other people may disagree, but they trust that person to make the decision for the right reasons. And so that's where that consent to other people making decisions really comes in. And so I definitely think that our team personifies that in a big way. There's been plenty of times where in previous teams, even I would have maybe put my foot down and said, hey, I think this has to happen this way. Like disagreeing with the designer or disagreeing like on like an element that should be there or not, right? Or like, I really think that this is the wrong way to do things when it comes to engineering, right? But the truth is that we trust each other enough that I will voice my concern. I'll tell them why, and if it doesn't change their mind, I step back, right? Like we move forward. And the truth is I think that's a really interesting point around like how you actually manage product managers too, is that the reality is that it's more important to make decisions than it is the decision itself a lot of the time. Like one of the things I started doing with people, like I think you definitely need to think about things. Like you want to try to plan ahead. You want to try to understand the circumstance. But if you're working in a very rapid iteration cycle, if you're moving very quickly, a decision you make right now is actually very unlikely to totally destroy what you do further on. There are some decisions that are like that. But I think, like, I would rather someone makes a decision and we move forward and we learn something than we hamstring ourselves for a week just arguing about it. Like, I just don't feel like that's valuable. I mean, I even started, there's a certain point where if there is the inability to make a decision or people don't feel strong enough to make a decision, I've been just keeping coins, actually like tokens, on my desk. And I'll just say, what are the top 2 options? And then I'll flip a coin and we just move forward. And there's another psychological thing there, that when the coin is in the air, everybody actually thinks what their ideal solution is in their head before the coin actually drops. So there's maybe like a little bit of a trick I'm playing on people with that too. But like, the reality is like, for those decisions, we're just like, we don't know like what's the best thing to do right now. Like, everything seems okay either way. Let's just do one, whatever one that is. So anyways, but I feel like it's like that type of stuff where the team really respects me a lot for the decisions that I try to make, and I respect the team a lot for the decisions they try to make. It's something that there's actually another person that I met through, that's like a friend of philosophy, Jordan. He works on a company called Parable right now, and he really, after I had lunch with him, he turned me on to Dave Snowden's work around it's complexity thinking, but it's more about this concept of sense making. So how do you understand the problem that you're working on, or how do you understand the reasons behind the problem? And so the Cynefin framework is really set into 5 different domains. It's not really it looks like a 2x2 graph, but it's really not. The 2x2 graphs that he's done around like knowns and unknowns and knowledge versus sense and all this stuff, he does have those. But in this particular case, it's really broken into 5 domains. And so the bottom right one is really the simple or ordinary domain. And so that domain is really focused on, well, actually, let me take a step back. Okay, so yeah, Cynefin is really about how do you understand what space you're in, and what rules probably apply to that space. So what that means is that if I'm approaching a problem, like say I get a new engagement where I have to understand, let's say it's, okay, I think like one of the ones that we get a lot is like a Facebook for X is something that we get a lot of pitches for some reason. And so the thing is that the way that people actually engage with each other online today is not that complex, right? Like, there's a bunch of ways that people do it today. And so that would be something that is, there's ways that people do it, and the way that people do it is fairly understood. But then there's other places and there's other types of problems where, because of the complex nature of it, and the fact that there's this emergent behavior, means that you can't use the same type of tools to understand that problem. And so this is where Cynefin comes from. And it's really 5 domains. So it's simple and ordinary. It goes into complicated, complex, chaotic, and then disordered. Okay? And so if you take the whole thing, it looks like a 2x2. The bottom right is really the simple or ordinary domain. And then it goes up to complicated in the top right. And then it's complex in the top left. And then it's chaotic in the bottom left. And then inside there's this little thing which is like the disordered domain. And disordered domain is actually the most dangerous place to be because you have no idea where you are. But there are important things that happen when you move between these different domains. Sometimes you'll do that through the disordered domain. So anyways, simple and ordinary, these are problems that have been solved so many times that someone on your team right now has probably solved that problem already. And so those are the types of things that can really be estimated, right? Like, those are the types of things that you probably want to do last because you kind of know how to do it. It's like, things like login pages. Like, yeah, you could reinvent the way you do login pages, and in some cases it may make a lot of sense. But in reality, like, having an email, password, and then maybe a button for Facebook and Google, that's just the way you should build it, right? Like, you probably shouldn't do much else. There's some interesting things that people like Slack have been doing with like magic links, that type of stuff. I think we're going to get to where that is more in the simple domain as well, but that's maybe not exactly there yet. Complicated is a domain where experts really rule. And so that's where, if simple is something where you can categorize something and then take action on it, that's where there's best practices. That's where you maybe have a manual that says how to do something. Complicated is a manual, but that manual is like 10 times as long. And it requires experts to really weigh in and use the good practices that they have. So that could be like SAP integration and setup, for example, is one of those things where, yeah, there's a bunch of people that customize or specialize in this type of thing, but not everybody knows how to do SAP integration. probably is something that unless you used an expert, you would take a lot of time trying to figure it out, right? I think the other thing about, and so then complex is really where a lot of the interesting work happens, and that's probably where philosophy as a group, what we specialize in is really complex work. And so that's where maybe in simple, where you sense something, and a lot of this also goes into like OODA loops, which is a Boydian concept around like observe, orient, decide, act, who's a military, like a strategist. But this idea of like, how do you figure out what to do next, right? And so in the simple domain, it's really about sense, categorize, act. So that means you look at something, you decide what it is, and then you take action. So very simple. In the complex domain, though, you actually don't know how the system works yet. And so from that standpoint, you actually have to probe, which is do an experiment, sense, and then act. And so that's where the idea of like research, like user research, that's where user research really comes in, is that you're doing this kind of probing, you're maybe creating an MVP page and see how people react to it. Like Lean is a lot about that kind of complexity approach. Any of this contextual inquiry where you're trying to understand how people do things. The complex space is really about that there's this huge network of people that are all interacting with each other. And because they're individuals, you don't know exactly how that system is going to work until you actually do something with the system. And then chaotic is really just, it just basically means like, you know, your house is on fire and so get out of the house, essentially. And so this is where like, you'll find that chaotic actually is an interesting time because a lot of the time when we kick off a project, we're actually in the chaotic space. And so because we don't know what to do yet, right? Like the project is moving forward, we're billing our client, the client wants to see results. And so it's like, oh shit, what are we gonna do now? And so that's where the things that we do automatically by acting first are things like doing a kickoff, where we try to do basically a brain dump from the client. You know, we do research in the field, we do sales safaris, we start talking to people. Like there's a bunch of these like tools that we just automatically start doing because we don't know what's actually gonna be effective yet. And so we just need to find out what's going on. And so that's really the Cynefin framework and the way that works. So the way that we try to apply this, though, is like I said, you know, things that are in the simple or complicated domain, we think about those as things that, while are interesting, they probably are things that have already been developed by other people. And so we can use best practices, right? We can use whatever a heuristic would be around that type of implementation. There's probably, if you're dealing with like Ruby, there's probably gems out there that already do something like that, right? So it's not so much about us innovating in the simple or complicated space. It's really about that complex space. So what's that glue that we need to now figure out the special sauce for that particular solution? And how do we, and so a project could spread across all of these different domains. And it's really just trying to figure out the main thing that you're working on, like where is that fit? And so I think there's also another, maybe even lesser known tool set called a Warbly map, which I've been reading up on recently, which talks a lot about how different types of technologies are in different stages of acceptance or commoditization. And so using that as your decision-making process for where do you really like innovate, where's your differentiation? And so there's actually a blog post I'm working on right now around how we use competitive analysis to do this type of where the table stakes in the industry versus what are really the differentiating things, and then how do you use that to understand what's unknown and where can you really do something interesting. And so I maybe getting really down to like an exact way that we use Cynefin is that when we're trying to say we are doing like an 8-week engagement for a particular client, we have an idea of what we need to do maybe after the first week. And so we have maybe a problem that we want to solve. We haven't necessarily deep dived into all the solutions that could be created or tested, but we are starting to work on things. And so the things that we decide to work on first are those ones in that complex domain. And so that means like when we're doing user testing, when we're doing user research, we focus on the problems or the aspects of the problem that are so unknown rather than the things that are known first. And so we actually reverse what maybe would be your gut instinct to do is you like, oh, let's just knock all these things out that are easy to do, right? Like let's get those out of the way. But the reality is because they're easy to do, you don't need to learn much about them, right? You don't need to actually maybe change your plans once you learn about them. And so the biggest risks you have are really these unknowns. And so understanding which parts of your solution fit where and where you are within that whole set, that entire domain set, really helps you make prioritization calls for what you work on first. At least that's the way that we've used it. I think this again links back to the fact that complexity theory and kind of I've been, one of the passions I have right now is really around complex study, and so I've been doing some online courses with like the Cynefin Institute, which has a really great introduction to complexity. Been reading an awful lot about complexity. I guess I'm trying to put together what I would consider like my own personal degree about complexity and product management theory. And so I think we need to realize that complexity means that there's emergent behavior, that there's things that we're going to learn as time goes on, and that something we do today may not work tomorrow, right? So that's maybe the most interesting thing to me. Now, fluid mindset people definitely work better in the complex domain, but that's not to say that fixed mindset people are bad in any way, right? Like sometimes you just need to get stuff done. And so if that's the case where you're operating in the simple domain where something needs to just be executed on, it's good to know that they're there, because you can make decisions about who you hire, who you put on the project, that are good at doing this type of thing. Like if they've done that before and it's in the simple or ordinary domain, you should probably just use them. You should just have them charge ahead and do that, right? Like, so that's the way we try to look at all these different domains. The other side of everything that Dave Snowden does is this sense-making platform. And so how do you go out and collect narratives from hundreds to thousands of people and have them actually do the taxonomy or scoring of the answers in a very particular way so that they can't give you middling answers? And then how do you use that to actually do very interesting analysis and find interesting clustering of stories, so that not only can you now make decisions that, like, if you're an organization that wants to improve some aspect of your culture, you go out and ask all of your employees for stories or narratives that were related to that particular cultural aspect, and then have them categorize it. And then you can look at this huge graph of the whole space of these stories, and you see something over in this space, which is like, we really want to fix these types of stories, right? And so not only can you go in there and you can kind of see the alternate pieces of like the alternate quantitative data on top of like, why do those stories happen? But then you can go in, you can grab one of those stories and you can look at it and you can say, this is the reason why this type of thing is happening. And then there's 10 other stories where you can start to look at patterns. And, it's very much like jobs to be done where, going out and getting that pattern matching where you're like talking to 10 to 20 people and then you're looking at what is actually the job. I think this sense-making thing is just another term for this idea of like understanding or synthesizing and understanding about this complex system. And so the sense-making side is definitely the lesser known of Dave Snowden's work. But it's something that I've actually been experimenting with on my own it took like kind of like a certification class on their SenseMaker tool, but also just like in general, how do you build these types of narrative collection things? We're actually working on something internally to do this for how do we build better client skills for all of our consultants at Philosophy. And so anyways, I think there's a lot of interesting things there. And I think the way that I've started to look at this is that when we do a lot of research today, it's a very costly endeavor, right? Like if we're doing an interview with someone or we're doing a usability study, there's usually at least 2 to 3 people that are observing that one person for a half hour or an hour. Surveys don't always do a great job because they can be skewed in a lot of different ways. There can be a lot of bias, and then people will say things but actually do another. And so I don't know, there's something here where you're linking up kind of behavioral analytics with this sense-making narrative around a product and being able to then get like a multiplier on the amount of information you gain through this research by using this type of sense-making. And I think there's also something interesting about probes and how do you build these like MVP or lean types of things that then help you collect these narratives. And I think there's all this together ends up building this really interesting ability to understand complex systems faster and better than you would have before. So maybe this is like a long way to get around to my hypothesis or my thesis for the next couple of years is like really how do we make it easier to understand complexity within the world? And how do we build tools that help us understand this better so we can now build better things for the future, right? Like that's the thing that this complexity understanding is supposed to be about. Six Hats is really about, so the biggest concern I have in a meeting is that when I go into a meeting and there's a bunch of people, say there's like 3 to 5 other people in this meeting, right? I may know who they are, I may have an idea of how they generally act, but I don't know how they're acting right at that moment. They may have some type of like, maybe they had a bad day, and so they're being more pessimistic than usual. Maybe they had a really great day, so they're being more optimistic than usual, right? what Six Hats is really about is about trying to get everybody into the same mindset at different stages during the meeting, so that you are not having hidden mindsets biasing the conversation. And so I'm going to do a really horrible job of, I think I can remember all of the Six Hats, but maybe you'll have to remind me. So there's the blue hat, which is really an informational hat. There's a yellow hat, which is an optimistic hat. There's the red hat, which is a emotional hat. There's the black hat, which is a pessimistic hat. And then there's the white hat, which I think is like a decision hat or something like that. Is that 6? Yeah, I think that's 6. Oh, there's a green hat too. There's a green hat, which I forget it. Anyways, I would have a guide with me to be able to set this up. But what it means is that, like, when you get into the meeting, you say, okay, everybody, we're starting this meeting. Let's just blue hat this for a little bit. Okay, and so blue hat is like, all right, now we're only talking about information. We're not talking about opinions, right? We're not talking about how people feel about this. We're not going to say good things about this. We're just going to say, what are the raw facts that we know about the situation right now, right? And then you'll go into something like yellow hatting. You'll say, like, well, so what is the good thing about this? Like, what's the optimistic view of this particular situation? Like, what are the best cases that could come out of this? And then you go, and then you go to like black hatting. You're like, okay, everybody, we're going to be as pessimistic as possible, right? And this is very much related to a technique that I really love called pre-mortems, which I really love, which I could talk about in a second too. But like, again, the biggest concern you should have in a meeting is that everybody has all these crazy mindsets that you don't know about that will bias the conversation in some way. And so the Six Hats are really just a way to get everybody to think about their mindsets and to maybe alter them so that everybody's on the same page. We tried it a few times. It was okay. It felt a little hokey, to tell you the truth. So I think like it's probably a good icebreaker. Like if you really have a bunch of different personalities that haven't worked together before, I could see this as like an interesting technique. Could kind of like make a joke of it, but really people are priming themselves for these different mindsets anyways. So I could see that as an advantage. But yeah, it's a very tough line because like you want to have confidence to be able to work on the things that you should be working on, right? Like that's the key. That's the biggest downfall of that type of thing. Like you deserve to work on great things, right? But the other side of it is that people that think they know too much won't learn anything, right? And so I don't know. It's a very delicate line. I think there's a lot of those places. Maybe that's where there's like this duality. Again, it's not duality, but it's like walking the line in product management. Is that you need to be able to understand the way that you are in both ways, and how do you kind of again amplify your strengths, mitigate your weaknesses, and work in a team that's really effective. I mean, that's really what it's all about. And so the imposter syndrome is a useful tool in certain cases, right? Even though I wouldn't call it a tool, I think it's something that happens to people. But like using it as a tool is one of those things of making the best of a situation. Well, I think like this is like for people that maybe get like depressed, for example, there's a certain point where when people get depressed, they can realize that they're being depressed for no reason, and they can still feel depressed, but they can look at it as a third party and say, this is going to pass, right? Like this is a depression thing or a biological thing rather than this is really the way the world is, right? And so I think like imposter syndrome is an interesting one because as a tool, like being able to look at it from the side. So when you're living in the imposter syndrome, it's like, oh God, I'm not good enough. Like, why do these people are all going to find out that I'm an idiot and that I'm just scraping by because I keep pushing forward, right? Like, that's what you feel. But if you look at it from the outside, it's like, there's a reason why people are giving you respect, right? Like you feel this way because you understand something more innate about the way the product is happening, right? Like, or the way the project is going on. And that's where I think like we try to be too calculated in some ways. Like the reason why people feel angry or feel sad or like happy about things, even if they can't explain it, it's because there's something in their reptilian brain and their emotional systems that's causing them to feel that way. The problem is how do you unpack that, right? And so imposter syndrome, I think as a tool is more like, it's not the actual feeling of like, paranoia that you're going to be found out. Like that's not the good part of it. The good part of it is like, how are you now understanding why you may be good at something? Like looking at why other people are feeling this way towards you, right? But then also alternately, like how is it that you're using this to understand where your insecurities are and why you may have those insecurities, right? That to me is like, that's all about that self-improvement, self-analysis type of stuff. But yeah, it's just, yeah, that's how I use it as a tool, I guess, is I try to think about it from those sides. product management has always tried to have a close relationship with their end customers. But I think that being really great at doing unbiased research and a variety of unbiased research, I think is really a key aspect that product managers maybe have not focused on as much. Because, especially like when I was at Microsoft, we had a separate design team, we had a user research team. And so a lot of what we would do, what I would do today, where we think a lot about kind of the research that we're doing, it was very separated from me. I could listen in on some of these things, but I wasn't given the ability to actually participate as much as I probably wanted, should have. I didn't realize I should have. So like honing all these abilities to ask unleading questions, honing these abilities to just let people talk about things, to really like where to ask for more information. And then the other side of research is really being great at doing synthesis and organization of that information. And so something that I think we still haven't gotten right at Philosophy, and we do lots of research, right, is that there's like different companies that are trying to attack this as well. But just like, how do you collect all this information so that later you can reference it? So one of the tools we use at Philosophy, we use something called a rainbow sheet. And basically a rainbow sheet is really just, it's a technique for collecting observations. And so there's a raw format, which is really just like whatever happens, you just write down. And then there's a list of things that we're looking for that either happened or didn't. And so what you're looking for is when you talk to like 5 different people, say, you'll see a pattern that for this thing, no one got it. For this thing, everybody got it, right? And so it's really like a quantifiable way to understand this. But the problem is that for every week we do research, we have another rainbow sheet. And then, we try to synthesize it into kind of user research reports, which we then share with the client. And that's where we do the synthesis about what did we learn? What does that mean for the future? But I really think like there needs to be more around how all this is organized. And we keep everything on, say, Google Drive, right? Some people could keep it on Dropbox or wherever. But it's just, you then are depending on kind of like basic text search to find past times that something came up. So I think like that, there's still something there that like that skill set around collecting all that information and then synthesizing it into a way that is kind of like future accessible and doing that is really hard. I don't think it's easy by any sense, but it's something that if people can get good at that, I think that's really helpful, especially when you're talking about, when you have products that are lasting years and years, you want to understand how things have changed as time has gone on, right? Like, how does this customer now think about things versus the way they used to think about things? Because you need to now make changes in the way your product works. And that could mean revamping, which I think is always a bad idea, by the way. But like, it could also mean like this feature doesn't mean the same thing anymore, right? Like to this person. And so how do you know that context, rather than just, oh, we did the wrong feature? That's not true. You did the right feature for the time, probably. It's just that things have changed. So I don't know what the right way is yet. And that's something, I don't know, maybe another like side thing I've been thinking about is like, how do we build the right tools to allow for this? But there's a company called Optimal Workshop, I think. They have a tool called Reframer, which is supposed to do this type of collection. And we're experimenting with that a little bit. It doesn't do everything we want. But again, like, it's probably better than just a bunch of Google Sheets, but maybe not. Like they have some interesting visualizations of things, SenseMaker, which is the cognitive edge, Dave Snowden, Cynefin thing, does some interesting stuff around collection of that as well. So I don't know, there's a lot of things that are out there, but there's not anything that really does it great yet, I don't think. I think if anything, it's really just that Agile is maybe becoming more than just lip service. Maybe that's the thing that I think is really starting to happen. Because this ability to deal with unknowns, to deal with failure, to deal with adjustment and iteration, those are things that teams are really starting to internalize. And I think places like Scrum were really kind of a retrofitting of agile things within larger hierarchical command and control type of organizations. That's why there's so much around velocity and pointing and all that type of stuff, I think. So to me, like, this idea of using Agile is like really a mindset tool, or again, like the way that you actually believe things exist in this world is a tool that has really been very powerful. I think it's actually a really good thing. I just think that there's a lot of old guard kind of organizations, and we definitely deal with this, that even though they give a lot of lip service to Agile, when the shit hits the fan, they revert back to incredibly tight control, even though the reality of the shit hitting the fan is really more like, we're learning something very interesting and we should be adjusting. Well, I don't think it's negative. I mean, I guess I always joke with my designers that, design and marketing and everybody wants to get a piece of product management nowadays. So like when you're interviewing for a job, there's probably like designers and other people that are worrying about the end-to-end customer cycle and all that type of stuff. I don't think that's a negative trend necessarily. The truth is like believing in any one tool too much is maybe the thing I'll see in certain cases. So like people that are just like so much into one thing rather than trying to understand the variety of all these different possible tools and processes. It's just that type of mindset that I think I still see, and I'm hoping that the people that are that are basically managing these Agile teams, they use that as like a pendulum swing back towards the more command and control. And so, I don't know, I think it goes in cyclical kind of like motion, that there's always this like people get a little bit more agile, people in management get a little freaked out because they can't control everything. And so then they ratchet down on like all these processes for estimation, all that type of stuff. And then they loosen up a little bit because they start experimenting more. And then it's like, oh, something gets screwed up, but then they ratchet down again. So I think it's more cyclical than anything, but I think the pendulum is going, the middle state is getting closer and closer to Agile, at least for the teams that I've seen. But I worry about that these like command and control situations will become more entrenched as time goes on. But thankfully, those types of businesses go out of business usually rather than stick around. Based on the trend that design is getting more and more involved in kind of the how does someone interact with this system, I think what that means is that product managers, there's always been a wide breadth of what product management does, right? Like there are people that are more glorified project managers but have the product manager role, right? There are people that are true product owners in the sense that they're like the CEO of the product. There are people that, maybe in large companies, they own this feature within this product type of product management, right? There's lots of types of kind of like interesting niches around product management. But I think what we're going to see is that design, because their focus has been research and because their focus is about interaction, they're going to take over a certain amount of this. Like for a long time, I truly believe that like interaction design was in the space of product management, right? And I still do believe that product managers need to be good in some way at interaction design. But you don't have to be as great at it as they used to be, because now designers are thinking about that type of thing all the time. And that's why, product design is actually a role now, right? And so they're doing more of this product stuff. And so I think that means for product managers, though, is that means that product managers are going to be moving into more of a role where, again, it's this alignment of strategy to prioritization. And that's really the core aspect that I think product managers still will own over the next 5 years, but maybe we'll have to specialize in more. And that's also, I think, like why product managers thinking more like business development people may help them be more successful, in the sense that, there's really like a couple things that you're trying to pull together as a product manager. And it's usually focus on the customer, right, or the user, or the person that's actually using this stuff. But the other side of it that generally is more about management's concern is how does that align with the business strategy of the organization, right? I think that role is more and more within the product management camp as time goes on. And I think it's more and more important for you to think about how your product exists within the ecosystem of products and within the world, and what does that mean for things like pricing, for value capture, for like even growth. Like the idea that there's growth product managers now, that to me is really just like, that's like a marketer that became a product manager, right? That maybe then mixed in some stuff around like BD channel type of stuff, right? Like, so I think like the concept of product manager is still going to be a big question mark for a lot of people, like when we talk about the breadth of the role. But I think like if you're able to focus on more of that, like strategy, when I think about strategy, is how do you link this really like end goal vision with the way that the business executes and then the day-to-day prioritization? How do you align all those things within your role so that your team is successful and efficient, right? Like that's really what that's about. And so I think it's just going to be less and less about this kind of interaction stuff as time goes on. I think also from a marketing standpoint, the idea of brand as part of a user journey, right? Like there are people coming from that direction as well. And so the idea of like growth product managers, I think maybe a more nascent role that gets recaptured by marketing at this point. Product management is getting back to the core of kind of like, why are we doing things, and worrying less about these ancillary things, because I mean, everybody is realizing that understanding why people do things is really the core to building great businesses, right? And so that's why design is getting involved. That's why marketing is getting involved. That's why even, maybe the CFO would set pricing strategy at some point, but the product person needs to think about that more, right? So anyways, I think that's how the industry as a whole is kind of moving. Designers are going to come in and be more instructional about the features that are actually built for people. So like, whereas product managers would say that there needs to be a button to do X, right? And then they'd say, hey, design, make this pretty. I think it's going to be more like design is going to say, based on the research that we've started to do, right? There's this problem, right? And so now working with product to figure out what are the possible solutions, and then how do you prioritize a solution to experiment with? And so I think that's where design is a bit more like they'll do more of the actual, like, they still do the wireframing, they still do the interaction kind of like storyboarding and stuff like that, but it's more within their camp from the standpoint of like, this is a feature that they're maybe helping co-develop with the product person. But to be very clear about this though, is I think it's still within the realm and very important for product people to be involved in the research. Even though it is more in the design's wheelhouse right now, I think that's something that we need to take away from them or join and co-author with them, right? Is the fact that this research is so key to the things that we do, right? Like for us to be able to, like, when you look at something like Job to Be Done, right? And the way that you build narratives of how people came to that decision point, right? That is something that a designer could do that research, right? But I actually think that like a product manager is probably more appropriate to do Job to Be Done style interviewing. Whereas when you look at things like contextual inquiry, that is kind of like product and design. When you look at usability, that's maybe more core design. So there's all these different types of research that are out there. Like competitive research is another one where, like I said, I think that's generally product manager's role. I've been trying to get design more involved so they can see how competitive research happens and maybe innovate on that a little bit. Because I think like the whole table of checkboxes approach is the wrong way to go about it nowadays. And then same thing with like sales safaris, or even, the idea of interacting with the community that you're trying to understand online, which gets back to that like complex area of probe. And so I think like that's where design and product are going to be working much closer together to figure out like the spectrum of research that needs to happen. There's maybe pragmaticism is what we have, right? I think there's a lot of great things about lean, right? There's a lot of great things about agile. There's a lot of great things about the idea of trying to get like even waterfall ideals of like trying to understand a problem more before you work on it. There's all good pieces of these things. And so I think being more adaptive to the situation, I think is really the future process, right? So when I talk about like retros being key to your organization, I don't mean it just in the agile way, right? Like I don't mean it that there's a certain set of questions you only ask during retros, right? And that it's related to agile process. But it's really about this fact that you're taking, well, and the truth is there's like 50 types of agile, right? Like there was like an article that had a slide deck that was just like every type of agile thinking that's possible, right? So there's not a lot of like, there's no one right way, right? And it has to be adaptive to the actual situation you're in. I think what's going to be interesting about the process in the future is how do you figure out what the situation is that you're in, right? Right now, we have a lot of clunky tools for figuring that out by doing user research, by defaulting to certain types of processes or cadences, certain types of meeting setups, I think like it's more about like how do we decide which tools are appropriate for this scenario, right? And I think we're constantly trying to understand that, and we do that via retros. But I think like maybe there's something about like for these types of situations, these types of processes works best, right? Because I've seen agile teams that struggle with work that like we've worked with a client where it's like we just need to get this done. Right. And the truth is they don't want us to be experimenting and doing this interesting stuff. Like they actually in reality don't want to know that much about their customers. Right. We try not to take those jobs, but like, because that's not what we're great at. But that's the problem, is that in those cases, we need to realize that our process that was like all about agile learning is not right for this particular thing. We just need to knuckle down and pound out this thing, right? So I think that's the thing, is like we're going to get better at the meta level of what processes should we be using. And it's not just one process. It's a variety of processes that we cobble together, and we constantly adjust. I don't know if I buy that it's going to be that fundamentally different. You know, like I think it's evolved as time has gone on. Like it's definitely different over the 15 years that maybe I've done product management, right? But the core is still there, right? And I feel like it's true about engineering and design as well, right? Like design is changing, definitely. I think maybe we could talk about like design 5 years out is going to be very different. But like, you know, engineering is still about writing code that you can continue to build on top of as time goes on, right? Like, and it's something that meets a need. That's really what they're doing. And there's always been new tool sets. There's been different development processes. Like, so I think like that's maybe the point. Maybe that's the point I'm trying to get to, is that it's not so much about that product management is going to be so drastically different 5 to 10 years from now, but it's the fact that we feel more comfortable in our own skin, that we are doing something that's inherently valuable, and that over time we still are using a variety of processes, and we're not worried about whether we're providing value or not, right? Because like it's still 15 years in, and people still read articles about what do product managers do, right? And so maybe it's just like maybe the evolution of our role is that people just understand that it's not as simple as writing code or creating mockups. Which I would say that if you say that about an engineer or a designer, they would bristle at that thought, right? But they don't even know what to say a product manager just does, right? And so maybe that's where I think over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to get more accustomed to this type of ambiguity, right? And we're going to get more accustomed to not knowing, right? Like getting back to the Dunbar number, we have 100, you know, if 150 is the maximum that we can understand, we now live in a world where 6 billion out of the 8 billion people that live on this earth are actually connected to each other via social media in some way, or the internet in some way, right? Maybe 5 billion, right? But like that's orders of magnitude beyond that Dunbar number. And so the thing that we need to do is like, what are the processes or tools that help us do a better job of understanding that we don't know everything, right? And how do we feel more comfortable? So maybe it's more just like this, maybe it's like a psychological practice of being comfortable in the fact that we don't know. We live in a world that is starting to get out of the grasp of basic human understanding, and it's no longer cause and effect, right? Like that's the whole point of complex adaptive systems, is that you no longer know that if you do X, it will be Y, right? So these concepts around induction and deductive reasoning no longer apply to the world, right? And I won't get into what abductive reasoning is what product managers do, right? And I think just the thing that I constantly struggle with is like, how do I build something so that abductive reasoning, that research to understand how these systems work, and how do we do it in a way that allows a regular person to understand these things? I think that gets to the crux of when we have problems in communicating with people. Like you look at the last election and kind of the division with the United States. I think part of the problem is that we don't expect that we can understand each other, and we don't want to understand each other. And we don't understand how the world actually is working in the way that it's all of us together, right? And so I don't know. I really am like, I'm constantly looking for those tools that help us do a better job of explaining the way things are. Now, the problem is, and I'm rereading the Foundation trilogy by Isaac Asimov right now. And so like the idea of like psychohistory, which is a fictitious scientific pursuit, but you know, the thing that they bring up that I think is very interesting, and I think could apply to this, is that anytime, the biggest problem with complex adaptive systems is that anytime that you do something to them and it realizes or it adjusts to what you do, it means that you can't do the same thing again. So that means that if you make, say, estimations about way something works, if someone knows about that estimation, there's a reason why like stock markets work the way they do, right? Like everybody has a system, and every hedge fund has a system that works for a little while until it doesn't work anymore because everybody's already absorbed the ability to understand that system. My worry is like, we need to understand more to do a better job on these types of problems, but there's also going to be people that push back on those understandings of those problems. Like if you look at the way that like a lot of like trolling and like all the bots and the way that it skewed things like the presidential election, that was basically a reaction to an understanding about the way the election was going to go, right? And so anyways, I don't know, I have like all these thoughts swirling around in my head about this type of stuff, and so it's something that's really interesting to me, and just like I think that's where the impact of the world is going to be, is how do we do a good job to make the world better by understanding these systems.